child is pointing to. The child is pointing to something which
Still
we
our
consider
index of
is not a thing. The child is pointing to an area, say, of funny pattern on a dirty wall, and has noticed a figure on it. But the child doesn't have a word for it and says, "What's that?" And the adult says, "Oh, that's just a mess." Because that doesn't count for us as a thing. So you go through this to the understanding. What do you mean by a thing? It's very fascinating to
He went
understand.
up on stage, and it became this whole
What do you mean by a thing? And they don't know. Because it's one of the unexamined suppositions of the culture. What do you mean by an event? Not everybody knows what an event is, but nobody can say. Because a thing is a think. It's a unit of thought, like an inch is a unit of measurement. But the problem that arises is this. First of all, very obviously, everybody knows, I hardly need to mention it. Go to the science of medicine. You get a specialist who really understands the function of the gallbladder. And he studied gallbladders ad infinitum. And he really thinks he knows all about it. But whenever he looks at a human being, he sees him in terms of gallbladder. And so if he operates on the gallbladder, he may do so very knowledgeably about that particular area of the organism. He does not foresee the unpredictable effects of this operation in other connected areas because the human being's gallbladder is not a thing in the same way as a spark plug in a car can be extracted and a new one replaced. Because the system isn't the same. There is a fundamental difference between a mechanism and an organism, which can be described operationally.
The words which were formerly familiar are now
Mechanism
antiquated. So also the
is
names of
assembled.
those who were famed of old.
You add this bit to that bit to that bit to that bit. But an organism grows. That is to say, when you watch in a microscope a solution in which crystals are formed, you don't see this thing, little bits coming and joining each other and finally making up a shape. You see a solution where, well, it's like when you watch a photographic plate develop. But suddenly, the whole area which you're watching seems to organize itself, to develop, to make sense. Moving from the relatively simple and gooey to the relatively structured and prickly. But not by addition. So then, if we are trying to control and understand the world through conscious attention, which is a scanning system, which takes in everything bit, what we're going to run into is that if that's the only method we rely on, everything is going to appear too complicated for me. So that you get, for example, let's take the problem of the electronic industry. Catalogs of products that are being produced over the world by the electronic industry. Who has read all the catalogs? How do you know where you've got something you're working on, whether it's patented or not? Who else has taken out a patent? Has anybody had time to read all
Hammer,
the They're just voluminous. It's exactly the same in almost any other field. There's an information explosion, like a information explosion. How on earth are you going to scan all that information? Yes, of course you can get computers to.
Hello, Dr. Rowland!
But by Parkinson's law, the sooner you become more efficient in doing this, the more the thing is going to develop, so that you will have to have more
Everyone sounds the same.
information. Yes. see, there's this problem of the sort of competition of consciousness, of its, how fast can you go? And keep track of it, you see. And say, I've got a good memory, I can keep track of it. You say to you, I bet you can't. I'll go more complicated than you. See, musicians do this, but drummers, and they get things done. They so long as they count, lots of musicians do count. It's crazy, but they do. And they count, and they outcomplicate each other to the point where you can't retain it any longer in memory. So you say, okay, if I can't retain it, we've got this gadget here that can. And we've got these marvelous mechanical memories, and they will retain it. They'll go much more fancy. They'll go this duty at a colossal speed, like that, you see. But it's the same old problem. Because you've got something that can outdo that. So we end up asking, yeah. But supposing there were some other way of understanding things. Let's go back from the spotlight to the floodlight, to the extraordinary capacity of the human nervous system to comprehend situations instantaneously, without analysis. That is to say, without verbal or numerical symbolism of the situation in order to understand it. I hope you understand what I mean. It's clear. We do that. We have this curious ability of pattern recognition, which the mechanical systems have only in a very primitive way. Xerox have put out a machine which recognizes figures written in almost anyone's handwriting, provided their handwriting is fairly grade school and normal. But the computer has a terrible time trying to recognize the letter A when it's printed in, say, sans serif, Gothic, longhand, or whatever kind of A you may write. The human recognizes instantly this pattern, but the computer is still at a disadvantage here. It seems to lack a kind of capacity I would call field organization, because it's all punctive, it's digital. It's like a newspaper photograph, you know, which when you look at it under a microscope is all dots. Now, so the problem is this. In developing technology, are we leaving out of consideration our strongest suit, which is the brain itself? See, we are at a situation where the brain is still not really worked out by even the most competent neurologists. It puzzles them. They can't give a model of the brain in numerical verbal language. Now you are that, you see. You are this thing. You yourself are this thing which you yourself can't figure out. In the same way that I cannot touch the tip of this finger with the tip of this finger. I can't bite my own teeth. But I, who is attempting to touch the tip of this finger with this finger, am, by the sheer complexity of my structure, far more evolved than any system which I can imagine. This is, in a way, slightly akin to the Gödel theorem, that you can't have a system of, say, a logic which defines its own axioms. The axioms of any given system must always be defined in terms of a higher system. All right, so you are the most complex thing that has yet been encountered in the cosmos. And you can't figure you out. Now, suppose we're going to try to do that. and become, as it were, completely transparent to ourselves so that we can entirely understand the organization or the mechanics of our own brains. What happens when we do that? Well, you're back in the situation of God. When you're God, what are you going to do? When you're God, you know what you're going to do. You're going to say to yourself, man, get lost. Because what you want is a surprise. When you figure everything out, there won't be any surprises. You'll be completely bored. But on the other hand, a person, I would say, who is really functioning completely, is basically a person who trusts his own brains and permits his brain to operate at a more optimal level. In other words, he knows how to think things out, but he makes his best discoveries without thinking. In other words, you all know very well the processes of creative invention. You've got a problem, you think it over, and you can't find out any answer to it. Because the digital system of thinking is too simple, too clumsy to deal with. It's more complex. There are more variables than can be kept in mind at one time. So you say, I'll sleep on it. Or you go to the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, or Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, where they pay you to goof off, which is highly excellent technique. And you fool around and you go blackboard and look out and you pick your nose and so on. And your brain eventually finds itself the solution to the problem. And you immediately, because you have technical knowledge, you recognize that's a solution. But then, naturally, you go back and check it. And you work to do by that form of thinking on it. And see, now, does it come out in those terms? And if it does, everybody will agree with you. But if it doesn't come out in those terms, they won't agree with you. Because you haven't subjected it to the socially acceptable traditional form of analyzing knowledge. But here's the problem. It takes an awful long time to check these things out. It takes an awful long time to arrive at the solution like that by a purely calculated process. Most of the situations of life are such that they don't wait for us to make up our minds. So that an enormous amount of carefully worked out scientific knowledge is trivial. All very well, very finely worked out, but much too late. Because life presents you, life comes at you from all sides, all over everywhere at once. And the only thing you've got to deal with that is the thing inside here, in the skull. Now, I'm not saying this to put down all this marvelous work by calculation, brought to immense sophistication electronically and so on. Not at all, because actually you people are the first people to understand the limitations of your own kind of knowledge. And you're going to have to tell the politicians about this. They don't understand. They think that this kind of knowledge is the answer to everything. And I think most of you know it isn't. Which is not something, I repeat, against technology. It's only saying that when you walk, you put your right foot forward. That's fine, but then you must put your left foot forward. So let's say that the great technological enterprise has been putting the right foot forward. But you must bring up the left foot. That is to say, bring up re-evaluation and new respect for the organic type of organization, which is incomprehensible to technological thinking, but which always underlies it. That by itself doesn't work, because after you bring the left foot up, you've again got to bring up the right foot. The analytic. After goo comes prickles. After prickles comes goo. You have to keep this thing up. And I think our danger at the present time is that we are so heady, so delighted with the results of prickles, that we've got to let back a little bit of goo into the system. Well, now, what we've got to try and do is, I think, to work out a way of making the brain itself more efficient. And this is the thing that civilized education has neglected. Lynn White, to quote him again, used to say that the academic world today only values three kinds of intelligence. Verbal intelligence, mnemonic intelligence, in other words, good at remembering, and computational intelligence. So it entirely neglects kinesthetic intelligence, social intelligence, and he had at least 7 kinds of intelligence. I forget what they all were. But it is this extraordinary capacity of the neural organization, say, to engage in pattern recognition and in solving instantly certain complex problems without knowing who does it. The trouble is, when you do something you don't know how to do, you've got a non-repeatable experiment, in a certain sense. In other words, you can't explain to someone else how to put it together. But you can do it like you can open and close your hand without any knowledge of physiology. Do it every time. Whoops, I don't know how I did it. I just do it, you see. So we have an enormous potential of intelligence, of knowing how to do all sorts of things, which, to the extent that we are academically minded people, we won't allow ourselves to do, because we can't explain it. You know, for example, there's a way of cooling a brazing furnace. It's very simple. But engineers say it's theoretically impossible. It can't happen. It's like bees can't fly by the laws of aerodynamics, but they do. So the rather practical issue I come to is this, that technology, if it relies exclusively on linear thinking, is going to destroy the environment. It's going to become too complicated to handle. Man is going to be like a dinosaur, which had to have a brain in its head and a brain in its rump because it was so big. Now, the caveman kept a dinosaur, and when he went to bed at night, he'd clump it on the tail with a club, and it'd scream at 8 o'clock in the morning. Wake him up. It's usually we're getting into that kind of saurian situation with our technology, which is going to lead us to extinction. So the question is, are we going to foul things up by insisting on using linear input information and controlling it as the dominant tool of controlling the world? Or can we master all that, as we have done, and still use the linear input and analysis, but with a fundamental trust in our power to assimilate multiple input, although we really don't know how we do it. And my point is that you can't find an absolute which you can pin down, you see. So there always remains in any human operation the basic, essential thing, which you can't pin down because it's you. Just as the teeth can't bite themselves. Now, the assumption of Judeo-Christian culture that man in his nature is sinful and therefore can't be trusted. The assumption of at least ancient Chinese culture is that man in his essential nature is good and therefore has to be trusted. Because they say to us, if you can't trust your own basic nature, you can't really rely on the idea that you're untrustworthy. Therefore, you're hopelessly fouled up. So, this has amazing political and other consequences, this different assumption. If we say, no, we human beings are fallible and basically selfish and really, really fundamentally evil, and therefore we need law and order. We need a control system to put us in order. We thereby project these control systems into the church or into the police or into somebody who are really ourselves disguised. See, it's like daylight saving time. We everybody could simply get up an hour earlier, but instead of doing that, we alter the clock, because the clock is a kind of authority. And we say, well, the clock says it's time for you to get up. And the Amerindians laugh at the palefaces because they say, paleface, he doesn't know when he's hungry until he looks at his watch. And so in this way, we become clock dominated. And the abstract system takes over from the physical, organic situation. And this is my big pitch, if I'm going to make a big pitch, is that we've run into a cultural situation where we've confused the symbol with the physical reality, the money with the wealth, and the menu with the dinner. And we're starving on eating menus.
We're seen through the net with Alan Watts with the IBM Systems Group of Engineers. I'm your host, Mark Watts, and this podcast was co-produced with the Ram Dass Be Here Now podcast network. For additional episodes, tune into the Be Here Now network website. And for a great depth of Alan Watts spoken word recordings, visit alanwatts.org and alanwatts.com for download and streaming selections, as well as his video offerings. Our theme music is by Zakir Hussain, courtesy of Rock Records. And please join us in future weeks for other episodes of Being in the Way. Podcast, and today we're going to listen to the second talk from the Japan tours, Religion and No Religion. And this was a talk that he gave at Mount Koyasan, and it's a wonderful exploration of Buddhism. And without further ado, here is Alan Watts from Religion of No Religion.
I was discussing last night the Bodhisattva doctrine in Mahayana Buddhism and comparing it or relating it to the two great tendencies in Indian spirituality: anti-worldliness or otherworldliness and world affirmation, and showing how the idea that the highest kind of a Buddha is in a certain way a non-Buddha. The highest kind of a Buddha is like an ordinary person. And
Whose fat ass is that?
this comes out very, very much in various tendencies in Zen, where, for example, all the painting peculiarly characteristic of Zen Buddhism in the Chinese and Japanese tradition is, as it were, secular. It has a peculiarly non-religious atmosphere. That is to say, the painting of Shingon sect and Tendai sect, as you saw it in the museum today, was religious painting. You could tell at once that the subject matter of these paintings is religious. But with Zen painting, the way of dealing with philosophical or spiritual themes is secular. So that when an artist like Sengai, living in the 17th century Japan, paints the Buddha, there is something slightly humorous about the Buddha. He wears his halo over one ear. There is an informality, a slight raffishness. And so this comes from China, from those great Sung artists like Liang Kai, who painted the sixth patriarch of Zen, chopping bamboos, looking like the most extraordinarily unkempt country oak. So, also, the greatest Zen painting has as its subject matter not really religious themes at all. It uses pine branches, rocks, bamboos, grasses, everything of that kind. And you would never know that these things were icons. Likewise also in poetry, which we will go into more extensively in the future. The superb expression of Zen poetry is derived from the Chinese poet Hokoji, who says, wondrous action, supernatural power, drawing water, carrying fuel. Now, that poem is a little bit too religious for Zen taste. And so, preferable to that is Basho's famous poem, The Old Pond, a frog jumps in, plop. Plop is the only possible English translation for the Japanese Mizu no Otto, which means literally the water's sound. Plop. But that poem, you see, is a very high-style Zen poem because it has nothing in it about religion. There is a poem on the edge, which also was written by Basho, which says, when the lightning flashes, how admirable he who does not think life is fleeting. You see, the flash of a lightning is a Buddhist cliche for the transiency of the world. Your life goes by and it disappears as fast as a flash of lightning. That becomes a cliche. So, all religious comments about life eventually become cliches. And that's why religion always is falling apart and becoming a certain kind of going through the motions, a kind of imitation of attitudes. As if one would say, we've got a book called The Imitation of Christ. It's a terrible book. Because everybody who imitates Christ is a kind of a fake Jesus. So in the same way, there's all kinds of imitation Buddhas. Not just sitting on altars made of wood, gilded, but just sitting around in monasteries. So, one might say then that the highest kind of religious or spiritual attainment has no way, sign about it that it is religious or that it is spiritual. And so as a metaphor for this, there was used in Buddhism from the very beginning the idea of the tracks of birds in the sky. They don't leave any tracks. And so the way of the enlightened man is like the track of a bird in the sky. And as one poem, a Chinese poem says, entering the forest, he does not disturb a blade of grass. Entering the water, he does not make a ripple. In other words, there is no sign about him to indicate that he is self-consciously religious. And this goes too for the fact that his not having any religious sign is also not something contrived. It isn't like Protestant simplicity. You know, all those Catholics with their rituals and how dreadful it is. And all these contributions that were assessed by the church